Good day, citizens, and welcome, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. So good to have you with us. Thank you for listening.
I'm just in love with the Thomas Jefferson Hour, David. I look forward to it.
What else is new?
No, I have periods where I think, oh, who's listening? And, is Chrysler the only one?
I think we've lost him.
Yeah, I think he moved on.
And you know what? We got to talk to our friend Bo Wright.
Yeah, what's happened? We need to hear from him.
I think he won his election. I think he's a councilman now.
Oh, boy, that's the end of him.
No.
He'll be going on foreign junkets.
Well, I hope he still listens, and if he does, if you are listening, Bo, congratulations. Good for you.
Yeah.
And
dream higher is what I say, Bo.
No. Let's have a quick update from you sometime soon.
This program this week is about an Atlantic magazine article by John Dickerson called How the Presidency Became Impossible. It's not just Trump. The job is now too much for anyone. It's a long, fascinating, thoughtful, provocative article in the Atlantic. You can read it online. I urge everyone to read it because it really asks the right questions.
We will put a link up. Go to jeffersonhour.com and you can link to the article there. And, while you're at the website.
Oh, here it comes.
They make me do this, but while you're at the website, if you'd like to support the show, we cannot thank you enough, and we need your support, and it means a great deal to us. And it's not like we're buying new shoes or something.
I did buy new shoes with my own cash.
Or more books for Clay.
I do that too.
Everything that you send to the show goes into the show, and we can't thank you enough. Just go to jeffersonhour.com and click on Donate. You might consider joining the 1776 Club.
You should join the club.
And you'll have access to just about every episode ever produced and additional content. So I apologize for the intrusion and interruption into what you were saying, Clay, but
No. This article is so interesting, and I want to read a piece this is extra content that you get from the podcast edition. We didn't have time for this, but a letter was sent to President Harry S. Truman.
Oh, right, yes.
By a parent of someone who had died in the Korean War and who had won the Purple Heart. And this is the letter in its entirety. Mr. Truman, as you have been directly responsible for the loss of our son's life in Korea, you might just as well keep this emblem on display in your trophy room as a memory of one of your historic deeds. Our major regret at this time is that your daughter was not there to receive the same treatment as our son received in Korea. Now, David, that's a hard letter, but here's what makes Harry Truman so interesting. He kept it in a drawer for the next 20 years. He did not just turn away and send some awful tweet about how this person is a criminal and a buffoon and anti-American. He cherished that letter because it reminded him of the profoundly grave responsibility of being the President of the United States. When I read that, you'd never seen that before either, I don't think.
No, I hadn't.
When I read that, I was just so moved by that. I took a picture of it on my cell phone and sent it to my daughter and said, imagine this. Imagine being the president and having to send our children into harm's way and knowing that some of them are going to be maimed or have PTSD or be killed. Imagine that responsibility. And the fact that Truman was able to face that and to say this comes with the territory and to cherish this letter as a reminder of what's at stake. I just love that about him, and I'd never seen this before, so I'm very pleased that John Dickerson has published that.
Pick up a copy of this month's Atlantic or find it online, but it's a long article, but it's very thought-provoking, and it was very fun to hear President Jefferson sort of struggle with some of the modern issues brought up in this article.
It just proves to me that Jefferson has nothing much to teach us because he was actually able to stay on top.
Wait a minute. What did you say?
He was able to stay on top of the government.
No, not much to teach us?
Yes.
You want to qualify that?
No. Oh, yes. I'm trying to.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's all right. I'm just saying that he was able to stay on top of it. Today, no one would make that claim. I remember once, David, when I was much younger, and I gave a talk for one of the Supreme Court annual conferences. They have them all over the country every year. And I was Jefferson, and I heard a distinguished member of the court, still on the court, who had been recently appointed. And he said, I don't need clerks. I do it all myself. I think people who use clerks are lazy. I think that's really not the way to be a great justice. And the other justices just looked at him and said, "Yeah, we'll ask you in 5 years." And then it turns out later he humbly apologized and said, "Oh, I get it, that you can't even be a Supreme Court justice and stay on top of your paperwork. It's all of these jobs are just almost infinitely complex, and they require a level of attention. You think, well, when do they have time to golf? When do they have time to be with their families? When do they have time to eat?" It's Dickerson's point is that we're now managing we're managing the globe, this huge military, this vast bureaucracy. If there is a tornado in Oklahoma, the president has to go there. He's meeting the championship volleyball squad from New Mexico State University. He has to give political speeches. He has to do fundraising. He has to manage his cabinet. He has to present an annual plan to the Congress. And if you add up all the things that a president has to do, it's too much. Nobody can do it.
Well, it's not like anybody forced him to do it, but let's go to the podcast.
Well, let's let people decide for themselves. I really liked this show, and I want to know what people happen to think about it.
Here we are, this week's episode, The Hardest Job. Thanks for listening. Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me, I'm pleased to say, is Mr. Jefferson. Good to see you, sir.
Good day to you, my dear citizen.
I trust you're well and things are good at Monticello, sir?
During the growing season, I'm always filled with hope and optimism.
Myself as well. I've had my hands in the soil many times this summer already.
I can see it in the cheerfulness with which you preside over this conversation.
I thought perhaps you could see it within the dirt under my fingernails, Mr. President.
That is always a sign to me of virtue, that our character as a people comes from having a rootedness in the soil. And there is nobody, not George Washington, not Alexander Hamilton, not the King of England, not the Pope in the Vatican. There is nobody who should consider himself above the simple business of putting his hands in the soil and growing some of his own food.
Well, I do appreciate that assessment, Mr. Jefferson, and I shall use it in my own defense when necessary, with your permission.
I do, sir, believe in hygiene and cleanliness, and I would urge everyone to clean their nails as often as is practicable.
Yes, sir. Advice I shall take. Mr. Jefferson, I'd like to speak to you this week about the office of the presidency. It's changed and grown much since your time. In fact, I suspect it changed quite a bit just during your time.
We weren't quite certain what the presidency was, what the duties should be, how central the president should be to our political life. And as you know, the Constitution makers, reacting against the monarchy and the despotisms of Europe, had created our own system with legislative supremacy. So the president had a relatively limited number of tasks and responsibilities in my time. Even so, I found the presidency to be consuming. I entered that office when I was 57 years old. I actually felt that I might be a little bit too old to accept and handle the challenges of the presidency. I would have been, of course, 8 years older by the time I finally retired to Monticello. And I can tell you this, that I got up at dawn, I bathed my feet in cool water, as I always had done, and then I was at my writing table from 6 or 7 in the morning until late morning at least. I then would see cabinet ministers or others who had reasons to speak with the President of the United States. I then would go out for a horseback ride in the District of Columbia, come back and have the main meal of the day, which was often a social event. I often had members of the cabinet or political figures or scientists or men of letters to dine with me. And then I would go back to my private quarters in what you call the White House and work until late evening sometimes. And so the work was onerous. I found it tiring. There is never an end to it. I made things perhaps a little bit worse for myself because I insisted upon seeing every letter, every memo, every document that was issued by the government of the United States, at least by the executive branch. This was a habit that I picked up from observing George Washington. He wanted to know everything that was going on, in his administration, and so he insisted that all of his cabinet ministers funnel their documents, their letters in and out through him, and I took that up as my own style as the third president. So just reading all of this material, even in a much simpler time, was very consuming. And I wrote as president 5, sometimes 15 letters per day, and they had to meet, of course, with the Secretary of State, my closest friend, Mr. Madison, or the Secretary of the Treasury, Swiss-born Albert Gallatin, or Henry Dearborn, the Secretary of War, or Senator X or Senator Y.
What you're saying, Mr. President, is that even in your time, the presidency was a hard job, which leads me to my question. I was referred to an article by a friend of mine. The article is titled "The Hardest Job in the World," and it's written by a respected news person, John Dickerson. It appears in this month's Atlantic magazine. And Mr. Dickerson writes about how much the office of president has grown and changed. And the question he asks essentially is, can one person handle all this? What's your reaction?
I can't know, of course, what the burdens of that office are in your own time. I will say this. In my time, when the population was 6 million, and when the overwhelming majority of us lived in the original 13 states, and in fact, I think more than half, more than two-thirds of the people lived within 30 or 40 miles of the Atlantic Ocean, and when we lived in a 3-mile-per-hour world, and we were a new country very far away from the havoc of the old world, I was able to keep up, but just. I had to work really hard during the 8 years that I was president to stay on top of the labor, the paperwork, the administrative duties of being the president of the United States. And keep in mind, sir, that during that entire period, I never traveled around the country. I never went to some place where there had been a disaster. I never went to an opening of a new bridge or a new harbor. I never went to any event outside of the District of Columbia, and very seldom any inside the District of Columbia. So I regarded the presidency as an administrative job and essentially handled the paperwork. And of course, my cabinet met to discuss the Barbary pirates or to discuss the latest depredations by the British or the French on the high seas during the Napoleonic Wars, or to plan for the Lewis and Clark expedition, or whatever it might be. But my point is that in my time, the job description of the president was much more narrow, and I was essentially the chief administrator of the country, not the sort of populist, often seen president in your time. During the whole course of my presidency, between 1801 and 1809, for example, I never held a news conference.
I'm not certain that you would get away with that during my time, Mr. President. But back to Mr. Dickerson's article, he writes about the American citizens' expectations of their president. And he says, quote, "We expect presidents to be deal makers. Even when the opposition has calcified, they are supposed to drink and dine with the other side and find a bipartisan solution. And, sir, you seem to be able to do that."
Well, there was a smaller government. Washington City, the new national capital, was still in a state of frontier simplicity, let's put it that way. It was still largely a pastoral place. Washington City was really very primitive during the first years of the 19th century. I was the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., although the second president to live in what you called the White House. So there was a lot of complaining and whining about the lack of sophisticated society and the kinds of boutique shops that gentlemen of my era were dependent upon, not even good hotels and good restaurants in the District of Columbia in my time. So everyone, therefore, looked to the White House. They looked to me. I was known to be a gourmand. I knew a great deal about wine. I believed in manners and in hospitality. And so I used my office to provide some level of comfort to all the people who were in the District of Columbia. And I would have 10 or 12 people several times per week at round tables in the White House, and I made all the seating charts and the selections myself. And I would have Federalists now and Republicans another time and men of letters and scientists, and sometimes I mingled them, but this was all done to create a level of comfort that otherwise was not available in the new District of Columbia, but also to soften political disputatiousness. I felt that if I could bring in Federalists, many of whom disliked me intensely, and show them good hospitality, serve them great food, good wines, sometimes exquisite wines, that they would be a little less partisan and a little less aggressive. They might forgive me my political outlook because they admired me as a personal host. And so I use this work of hosting dinner parties and hosting 2 receptions per year, one on the 4th of July and one on New Year's Day. I use those occasions as a way of building harmony and taking the edge off of the kind of vicious partisanship that was just as much a part of my era as it was of yours. The Federalists never liked me. In fact, they were planning secessionist movements in New England through most of my presidency, and particularly during the second term. They had predicted that my presidency would amount to a reign of terror, or that I would bring anarchy to our new republic, that the system would simply collapse under my Jacobin and radical leadership. And so it was important to me to show them that every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle, that we can dine together, that we can admire each other for those things we have in common, that there are many, many, many subjects that can be talked about at table that have nothing to do with policy or political wrangling. And I knew that anyone who came away from the White House well-fed, having had excellent wines, and having been treated with graciousness, even those that I actually personally disliked a good deal, they would be more likely to want to move towards the center and to do the right thing politically than they would be if we simply separated into camps that had deep mutual suspicions of each other.
Mr. Dickerson writes about partisanship. I'm not sure I agree with him. Let me read this to you, Mr. President. He says, quote, "The growth in partisanship means that when it comes to the basic business of government, the president and Congress are in constant turmoil. Shutdowns and federal budget stalemates are now regular occurrences. Congress has not passed a spending bill on time in 20 years. Congressional oversight, once used to identify future risks and monitor the executive branch, is now robust mainly when it comes to tying the opposition's shoelaces together."
This may have something to do with a breakdown of civics and civility. Surely it does. I believe in artificial good humor, if it's not automatically there in human character. And so some of this is about habit. This kind of rancorous behavior probably isn't essential. But, sir, it's also possibly the case that the United States is too large a geography to be governed from a single pivot any longer. I actually wrote a good deal about this and said that maybe the Western states would form their own separate republic, English-speaking, friendly, sister republics, cousins, but maybe the whole system is just too large geographically. There are too many Americas, in short, to have them all dance around one national capital.
I guess my disagreement is that people seem to think partisanship is the worst it's ever been, but I know you can testify to the fact that it was pretty intense during your presidency.
I can say in a sentence that when I made the Louisiana Purchase, the greatest land sale in human history, the Federalists called it the wildest chimera of a moonstruck brain.
We do need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Welcome back, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you.
You said before we took our break that something about perhaps the nation was too large to manage properly.
You know, most countries are small. Switzerland, Portugal, even France is a relatively small country. Britain, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. And our geography is gigantic. You know, you can put it in a nutshell by saying that the Lewis and Clark expedition began, say, at Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, depending on how you look at it, and ended at the mouth of the Columbia River. So the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Not all of that was the United States in my time, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before the whole continent, essentially, and maybe everything up to the North Pole, belonged to our republic, the United States. That's an awfully large geography. There are mountain ranges that separate parts of it. The Appalachians separate the eastern seaboard from the great Ohio and Mississippi Valley. And the Rock Mountains, the Shining Mountains of the West, apparently separate the Missouri-Mississippi valleys from the Columbia system and so on. There are apparently deserts, some of them quite large. There's the whole treeless zone, that vast treeless zone through which the Missouri flows that Mr. Lewis found so fascinating. Why would there be a place that's treeless in a continent as fertile as ours? And then if you add to that the very weak infrastructure of my time, almost no roads of any sort. There wasn't a paved road in Virginia. Canals were just beginning. This was before the Erie Canal, which linked New York and the Hudson River to the Great Lakes in the west. Our attempts to build a canal on the Potomac as a better gateway to the west all failed, at least during my lifetime. You have wagons and horses and flatboats and keelboats and canoes and pirogues, but steam was only beginning to be used as a technology at the very end of my life, and then as a sort of gimmick so far. And so you have this gigantic continent spread over what you would call many bioregions with immense distances between settlements, and you're trying to govern it from a central national capital. Mr. Madison and I spent our lifetime thinking about this because those who understand what a republic is, say Polybius in the ancient world or Montesquieu in the modern world, they all said that the only thing that can survive as a republic must be small geographically, that a republic is an inherently compact polity. If that's the case, if the only republics that can survive intact are in small geographic units, then how can you possibly have a republic in a nation spread from Maine all the way to Florida and from the Virginia all the way to, say, Minnesota?
And yet here we are, Mr. President. How do you answer that question?
It may be that you're attempting to govern yourself with a system that cannot work with such an immense geographical base.
Oh, give us more hope than that, sir.
Well, we worried about this. Now, Mr. Madison wrote about this in the Federalist Papers, and I wrote about this, and we felt that if you subdivide the system into more manageable units, so regions and states and counties and townships and so on, eventually devolving to the farm itself, the Republic of the Farm, as we called it. By dividing and subdividing the system, you may be able to make it work over such a large geography. My only point is that when I thought about this, I actually was quite cheerful. I said, well, maybe the people west of the Appalachians will form their own republic. That doesn't necessarily damage us. We don't have to be just one country. We could be a series of sister republics, and there would be nothing particularly wrong with that. I wasn't looking for great American glory and power and majesty in the world, and so I wasn't, like Hamilton, a believer that we needed to have some juggernaut of a national government.
I wanted to ask you, what was the reaction to that, sir?
Well, most people thought that I was foolish, that this was the triumph of utopian theory over good sense. I mean, George Washington, our first great president, one of the greatest men who ever lived, said he spoke of an American empire. Even in the beginning, he used the word empire, seldom attempted to use the word republic, didn't, I think, really believe that we should be a republic. And so most people like Washington, like Hamilton, like Henry Knox, like even John Adams, had a vision of America as a great and powerful nation. I did not. My vision of America was of an enlightened, just, thoughtful, cultured, imaginative, artistic, agricultural republic, and that we would leave the rest of the world alone. We didn't, in my opinion, have any reason to be one of the great powers. I didn't want us to be asserting ourselves on the high seas. I didn't want a large navy and a standing army and a centralized government and a puissant economy. I wanted the republic of the farm, where people mind their own business and grow their own food and live with a freedom unprecedented in the history of the world. And I reckoned that the Atlantic Ocean was so wide, 3,000 miles, that it would effectively create a fortress for us, and we would never have to worry about foreign invasion or foreign meddling in our system, because we were just so profoundly separated from the cauldron of chaos that is Europe.
Mr. President, you talked about the great size of our nation, the distances. In my time, sir, a president is expected to do many things. He's expected to appear at, say, sites of natural disasters and comfort people, and he's at openings and ceremonies all over the country. And I look at you, sir, you didn't travel at all as far as being president.
While I was president for those 8 years, I traveled from Monticello to the District of Columbia and back, period. I never went to Baltimore, which was only 30 or 40 miles away. I never went to Philadelphia or New York. I never went to Charlotte or any of the cities in the Carolinas, certainly not to Georgia. I never went anywhere. I regarded my job as the presiding administrative officer over our executive branch. My home was at Monticello, so I went there 2 or sometimes 3 times per year, always in the late summer during the malarial heat of Washington, D.C. I refused to be in the Chesapeake during those months of August and September, but Congress wasn't there either, so it didn't really matter. But my only transit was from Monticello to the Capitol and back again, and I never even dreamed of going elsewhere. People sometimes said that I should follow George Washington's habit of touring the country. He had made a southern tour 1 year during his presidency, and then he'd made a northern tour in another year of his presidency so that the people could see him and that he could take a look at the country, and there would be parades and banquets and toasts and balls and receptions of different sorts. All of that struck me as wrong. It sounds like what you would expect the King or Queen of England to do, go on a progress in their and show themselves off to the people and have pompous parades and elaborate toasts and festivals and so on. All that struck me as not in keeping with our kind of Republican simplicity, and it seems to me that the president should not be that kind of a person. The president should be an administrative person who handles the paperwork of the country and, of course, tries to keep us at peace with the rest of the world, annually sends up a message to Congress suggesting certain types of necessary legislation, etc. But if there had been an earthquake in North Carolina, nothing in the world would have persuaded me to go there and to comfort the stricken. That's something that might be done by a governor or a mayor or a local congressman, but it certainly, I think, would aggrandize the presidency in a way that is dangerous for human liberty.
One of the main points that Mr. Dickerson makes in this article, Mr. Jefferson, is that the presidency has gotten so huge, out of control. He says, quote, "The office hasn't just grown in power, it's grown in scope, complexity, and degree of difficulty." And the amount of people that work in the federal government, in the White House alone, there's 400 people working. In civilian agencies of the federal government, there's about 1.5 million people working. Can you even imagine that, sir?
No, of course not. I said that government is a few plain duties performed by a few honest men. A few plain duties performed by a few honest men. I can tell you that during my 2 terms as president, I lived alone in the White House, and that included the offices of the White House, and I had 1 aide. The first one, of course, was Meriwether Lewis, and I recruited him from the armies of the West. I trained him in longitude and latitude on the White House lawn, and then I sent him, of course, on his famous mission. I always had a private secretary, an aide-de-camp, and Lewis was the first. And then, of course, there was the chef and the serving staff. Most of these were slaves. that I had brought up from Monticello and donated, as it were, to the work of the White House. But in terms of the number of employees doing the work of the country, not domestic staff, there were 2 of us in the White House, and the entire executive branch of government had about 300, I think it's something like 314 total personnel in my time, and most of them were in New York at customs posts and in post offices around the country and so on. In other words, most of them were not in the District of Columbia at all.
Mr. Dickerson says that the Congress-centered government of the framers' conception has shifted to one dominated by the executive, and I think that's true. What's your reaction to that, Mr. President?
Well, that would sadden me greatly. Whenever you put power into the hands of a single person, that's very dangerous. Think of Napoleon, think of Julius Caesar, think of Attila, think of George III, or Louis XVI for that matter. The theory of a republic is that you diffuse power. Instead of putting it all in the hands of one, which is essentially throwing dice, spread power out into the hands of the many. So instead of one president, you have a Congress in your time of 535 individuals. They're going to agree and disagree and debate and exchange ideas, and each one of them will bring a different geographic insight to the office and an understanding of different parts of our economy, a different political outlook, and all of that then will be distilled through honest debate. The Congress, the legislative branch, is the one that most closely embodies the will of the people, that the people of a district in Virginia or the people of a district in Pennsylvania send their congressman off to Washington, and he embodies their will, takes their agenda, whatever it might be, up to the halls of Congress and exchanges those ideas with other people from other congressional districts, and that creates representative government. But if you have a single person like Louis XVI, he may be insane, he may be a drunkard, he may be prejudiced, he may be a bigot, he may be somebody who loves war, he may be a coward. And so you get too much power in the hands of a single individual. That's always dangerous. Power always creates an intoxicating effect when it is concentrated in the hands of one or a very small number of individuals. So diffusion is the very essence of good government. If in your time the legislative branch has become subordinate and the executive branch has become supreme for one reason or another, that can't be good for the idea of a republic, and it may not be good for even the idea of human liberty and freedom.
Back to the presidency itself, in the article, a former chief of staff is quoted as saying, "In the presidency, there is an illusion of being in charge, but all presidents must accept that in many realms they are not." Was that true for you, sir?
I don't think so, and only because the government was so tiny. Most Americans didn't even know that there was a national government. They had some idea, perhaps, of it in civics, but they really didn't have any focus on the national government in the way that almost every American does in your time. Life was profoundly local in my time. People looked to their township, to their county, to the nearest village. It was a very different time, and not much was at stake compared to your era. And so it was possible in my time for the president to stay on top of the national, such as it was, the limited national public business of the United States. But as I say, it took an enormous discipline for me to stay on top of all of that because I wanted to see all of the correspondence and to know what was going on in each of the very small number of cabinet positions in my government. In your time, the world is almost infinitely more complex. The pace of life has changed dramatically. The innocence of an agrarian world before steam or before the Industrial Revolution is no more. The weaponry of your time is profoundly more dangerous and more immediate and more accessible than it was in my time. The communication systems of the world bring in distraction and stimuli from everywhere that simply wasn't the case in my world, where a letter or a diplomatic pouch took 6 weeks or more to cross the Atlantic Ocean. And so I don't think that it really is very useful to compare the burden of the presidency in 1803, for example, that's the year I bought the Louisiana Purchase, with the burden of the presidency in your time, because all of the circumstances and all of the conditions have changed. So in your time, a president inevitably surrounds himself with a whole series of deputies and lieutenants and advisors and consultants and clerks of different sorts. That wasn't necessary in my time because it was so tiny, our national government.
One piece of advice he shares is that presidents have to ignore the reviews and the constant chatter. There's too much of it, and too much of it is uninformed. And he also says it's important that presidents empower their cabinets, allowing some independence so that they can make decisions and see things through. What's your reaction to those points, sir?
I think it is important to try to turn away from the public chatter. Even in my time, there were Federalist newspapers and scandal mongers and pamphleteers and rogue preachers and gadflies, and they all had an opinion, and many of them had opinions that were not based in any kind of evidence. If you hearken to all of that, it could really disable you from doing the work of the people. I think it's important to listen to what appears to be the voice of the people coming from different regions and different cities and different occupations and so on, but to be stuck there, to be addicted to public opinion, I think is disabling for a president. Let me remind you that one of the greatest acts of any president during my time was when John Adams went home. He left Philadelphia, and he went home to the Boston area, and he thought through the quasi-war that was now occurring with France. This would be 1798 and 1799. He did not consult his cabinet. He consulted his conscience, and he decided that a war with France would be ruinous for the future of our experiment, and he sent a second diplomatic group off to Napoleonic France to try to work things out, and he did, and he regarded that as the greatest single achievement of his presidency. So I do think that one can become distracted by too much attention to the whims of the public and the whims of discreditable journalists.
Our current president seems to be a bit, he's a lightning rod. There are those who like him very much, and there are those who dislike him very much. If you could, Mr. Jefferson, what advice would you have for our current president, knowing some of the things he's up against during my time?
I don't know what advice I could possibly give because so many of the very basic foundations and conditions of American life have changed. I would only say this: the people are sovereign. It's the people who are America. Any given president is there for a very short time. His duty is to listen and to try to enact to the best of his abilities the public will. Any president who takes himself too seriously, any president who regards himself somehow as America, or thinks that his own person and family and his own sense of himself are more important than the public good, even if he should succeed in some measurable ways, that's a failed presidency. The great presidencies are always going to be ones in which the president is humbled by the office, he learns to listen more deeply to the American people, and he realizes that he is an ephemeral event in a nation that has a very deep-rooted social and political and economic structure, and that he should never think of himself as indispensable in any way, unless perhaps he's George Washington.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. I do so appreciate your insights.
You are most welcome, sir.
We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson and your weekly conversation with the gentleman who portrays President Jefferson, the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And it is he who is seated across from me now. Good day, sir. And thank you, before you respond, for sending me off to read this terrific article by John Dickerson, who I really enjoy. He's not on Face the Nation anymore, and that was like the one Sunday program I had to watch. I really enjoy his work a lot. He's got a lot of integrity. So it's a long article. It's in this month's Atlantic. We'll post a link at jeffersonhour.com, but what a great read.
It is great. I really enjoyed it. I saw it actually in an airport kiosk. I immediately bought it and read it, and then I texted you and said, we've got to do something about this. It is a long article, but it's brilliant. And here's what he does. He says, look, I know all we can really think about is the debacle of the Trump administration and the craziness of it. But he said, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. Trump is an outlier, to be sure, but the presidency itself has become an impossible job. Nobody can do it. And he looks to Barack Obama and says, here is a brilliant man, a good administrator, a man who kept his focus. He had a very clean private life,
and yet
he didn't really ring the bell, because it's impossible now, given all of the duties and the size of our population and the things that a president has to do. It's impossible for anyone to really do it very well, and we need to step back and think about that problem.
He quotes Leon Panetta in the article saying, "The modern presidency has gotten out of control. Presidents are caught in a crisis-by-crisis response operation that undermines the ability of any modern president to get a handle on the office."
But you know, David, and I'll just say this much about the current situation. You heard Jefferson today saying that if he worked really, really hard and kept his focus, he could just about stay on top of the pitiful little government of the early national period, 1801 to 1809.
Yeah, I think he had a little bit of trouble relating to our time.
And then you look at, say, President Obama, or for that matter, George W. Bush, who worked really hard at it and kept their focus, and they sort of were able to stay on top of it. And then you look at this president, and if the reports are true, that he's watching 4, 5, maybe 6 hours of television per day, that he's tweeting day and night, making calls to his pals and so on, you wonder, and I don't mean this in the snotty way, you wonder, when is he working? Because a lot of it is getting on Air Force One or on the helicopter or being in a limousine or going to give a talk or meeting people and so on and so forth, the daily briefing. How many hours does any president actually have that he can use to try to direct the destiny of the world's most important nation? And if you're taking some of that time, there's a 24-hour day, period, no more, and you sleep X, let's say it's 6 hours or 5 hours or 8 hours, that gives you X hours per day. Most of what happens to a president is that you're going to meet the Girl Scouts of America, or you're going to meet the ambassador from Portugal or whatever. That means that your discretionary time, the time you get to really be president, not just be a figurehead, is tiny. And if you're spending the bulk of that time watching Fox and Friends, I mean, that just can't be good, David. I know that every president has to delegate an enormous amount of authority, but Jefferson's point, while I was being Jefferson today and hearing him say, if I worked really, 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 really hard at it, I could just about stay on top of it. Then you think, what happens when you have someone who doesn't really work at it at all?
We can't really know what his work habits are, but I take your point.
Fair enough. My point is that if it was hard for Jefferson, one of the greatest administrative masters ever, then John Dickerson is surely right that today the presidency is a simple impossibility.
He does have some suggestions at the end of his article about sort of a manual for incoming presidents, how you should react and what you should do to be successful. I thought that was pretty good.
I do too. I think that, we need to make the best of the situation, because one thing that I know for certain is that the American people are wedded to our system. Whenever you talk about changing our Constitution, people get very edgy and defensive. We like our Constitution. It happened just the way Jefferson feared. He said, some men look on constitutions with a kind of sanctimonious reverence and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, too sacred to be touched. That is precisely how we look on our Constitution. So we're stuck with it. And if we're stuck with it, then we have to find a way to work around the inherent problems that an 18th century instrument trying to govern a 21st century world creates for you. And I think that Dickerson's suggestions are as good as any.
He also quotes George Bush, President Bush, in the article, saying it's how important it is for the American people that presidents succeed. That's not going to sit well with those that are very anti-Trump, but he does have a point.
No, I've been feeling this a lot lately. So just before we created this broadcast here in the barn, the president pulled us out of the Iran deal. He was just about to meet with the leader of North Korea. These are mighty global problems. These are potentially the cause of World War III.
No, they're not really business decisions. They're much bigger than that.
But my point is that we need him to succeed. Whatever you think about President Trump, we need him to succeed. We need peace in the Koreas. We need to make sure that we don't ratchet up the Iranian problem, but rather ratchet it down. All of us have an interest in President Trump's being a successful American representative and negotiator in these two flashpoints of the world, the Koreas and the Middle East. And however you feel about him, let's just say there are people listening who can't stand even the word Donald Trump. We should put that behind us in moments like this, because these are bigger issues than any single president or any single Congress at all. And it's in everyone's interest that the United States successfully maintain its place as the world's example of an enlightened republic. And so I really feel that all of the media, but particularly the liberal media, has gotten so addicted to watching the Trump administration fail that they sometimes forget that there's so much more at stake than this man.
Before we go to this week's essay, I want to leave you with one thing from Dickerson's article that maybe get your reaction to. It says, quote, "Until we fix the office, presidents will continue to be frustrated by its demands, and Americans will continue to be disappointed in their leader. We will enter another presidential campaign season desperate for a good outcome, but unprepared to choose someone who can reset the terms of success."
He points out that every presidential candidate promises to make America all that it can possibly be. And then, of course, the president has to preside over this gigantic, amorphous, self-divided kind of nation. And so inherently, every president is going to be a disappointment because of the kind of rhetorical, optimistic excess that we expect of candidates. Promise me the world. No president can deliver. And therefore, everyone is always a little disappointed with the result of that presidency.
Thanks so much, Clay. It's always a pleasure to converse with you and with President Jefferson.
My friend, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, it is a pleasure to be in the barn with you today.
And now, sir, it is time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thomas Jefferson famously wrote, "No man will ever carry out of the presidency the reputation which carried him into it." Think of the diminishment of the presidents even of my own lifetime. Lyndon Johnson had been so consumed by the war in Vietnam that he withdrew from the 1968 presidential race. Johnson loved and lusted for power as much as anyone who has ever been the president of the United States. But by the time he made his announcement at the end of March 1968, he no longer even dared to leave the White House because of the protests that followed him everywhere he went. Imagine hearing the chants, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" He was a broken man, his whole dream of his life shattered by the time he limped away in January 1969, after watching a man he regarded as a thug and a travesty of American values, Richard Nixon, inaugurated in his place. LBJ died quietly in 1973, far away from the arena, a haunted and fragile remnant of his larger-than-life persona. Richard Nixon became so embroiled in the criminal conspiracy that we summarize under the term Watergate that by the last weeks of his uncompleted second term, he actually told the people around him that he wanted to die, that he had gone to sleep the night before hoping that he would never wake up. Whatever you think of Richard Nixon, one of the most intelligent, thoughtful, geopolitically savvy individuals ever to serve as president, it's hard to know this, the depth of his unalloyed misery in August 1974, without feeling some compassion for the man. Richard Nixon, the president who wanted to die rather than face the humiliation of resignation. Jimmy Carter came into the presidency in 1977 with his goofy smile, his corn-pone innocence and virtue, his folksy small-town values, his vow never to lie to the American people, and his promise to heal the nation. And Carter wound up being a failed one-term president, partly because he was a micromanager, even controlling the calendar for the White House tennis court, partly because he dared to tell the American people the truth, that something was deteriorating in the American spirit, and partly because of the impotence of serving as president when the Islamic terrorists decided to humiliate America for 444 straight days during the Iran hostage crisis, which, among other things, birthed the late-night cable television talk show. If you look at the before and after photographs of America's presidents, all that vitality, including dark hair, health, and optimism when they take the oath of office, and then the grayed-out, sunken-eyed exit photos of mostly good men whose lives have been damaged by their time as president, whose lives have literally been shortened by the presidency, you wonder why anyone would want to reach that pinnacle of American life. When he was elected vice president in 1796, Jefferson said in relief, "The second office of this government is honorable and easy. The first is but a splendid misery." As I speak these words, former President George Herbert Walker Bush hovers near death. He cannot live much longer. Like many deeply devoted spouses, he loosened his grip on life when his beloved wife Barbara died in April 2018. Mr. Bush may have been fortunate to have been retired from being president after a single term. It is possible that it lengthened his life. At just under 94, he is already the longest-living former president, edging ahead for what it is worth of Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, both of whom lived to 93. Jimmy Carter is also 93, will be 94 in October, and it seems likely he will outlast them all. Carter has already written 37 books, which means that if he lives a few more years, he will top the writingest president, Theodore Roosevelt, who wrote 40, depending on how you count. Bill Clinton was one of the smartest, best-read, overtly brilliant individuals ever to become the President of the United States. Remember when he could instantly name and characterize the heads of virtually every country, including piddling ones, of the world? But he gave his place in history to his penis. I remember seeing him on C-SPAN, sitting while someone else spoke when the controversy was at its height. He looked so profoundly self-disappointed that all he had wanted all of his life was to be president, had lived for nothing else really, and then he had squandered it all for a series of pathetic dalliances with interns. But I'm sure there were moments when even Bill Clinton wished he were dead. He got through it, and the American people stuck with him. A booming tech economy did not hurt, and wound up being one of the better former presidents, although the word peculation will haunt him through history almost as much as priapism. Ronald Reagan is every conservative's favorite president. Many would erase someone from Mount Rushmore to add Reagan's chiseled Hollywooden visage there, but he governed far closer to the middle than his admirers like to admit, and by the time his second term was well underway, he was beginning to suffer from encroaching Alzheimer's disease, a bit like one of those Soviet premiers of the 70s and 80s who used to be propped up for the photo ops. The Iran-Contra scandal was worse in many respects than Watergate, and for it, President Reagan probably should have been impeached, waging secret wars against the explicit forbidding of Congress. Are we a republic, or are we a monarchy? But the country didn't have the heart to do it, and so Reagan, who was really just a tired, old, befuddled man by the time he flew away to California, was permitted to serve out his second term. He probably was too old to be president. His mental deterioration is very sad, and he and Nancy Reagan handled it with candor and dignity. But we need to remember that the White House is not a senior care facility, and we need our presidents to be alert, fully functioning, and on top of the profound responsibilities of the job. George W. Bush was a kind of smart aleck going in, all that shrugging and smirking, but 9/11 and his wars in Iraq and Afghanistan transformed him visibly, matured him, humbled him, deepened him. He has been a truly discreet and dignified former president, and his willingness to express his soul through painting, even though he is not as talented, say, as Winston Churchill, is wholly admirable, I believe. And then, of course, there is Donald Trump. I will only make the following predictions. I do not believe he will serve out his term. He promised to drain the swamp, but his presidency, his sons, his son-in-law, his cronies, his violations of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, his personal attorney, his cabinet officers, particularly Scott Pruitt, have turned the executive branch into a kleptocracy. If 40% of the American people can still believe that he is a welcome breath of fresh air, then it's on us, not him. The old adage that in our democracy we get what we deserve sounds pretty ominous right now, but it also seems true, alas. Finally, a word or two about Jefferson. His first term was mostly splendid, culminating in the Louisiana Purchase and the authorization of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But in his second term, America was nearly crushed between the two world powers, France and Britain, who were locked in an existential world struggle for survival. And nothing that Jefferson could do, nothing he could imagine, could really protect America from a series of national humiliations. The Embargo Acts failed to accomplish what Jefferson and Madison had in mind for them, economic coercion that would bring Britain and France to their senses, and meanwhile, those coercive acts offended the farmers and merchants of the United States to the point, at times, of open rebellion. Jefferson, who came into the presidency wondering if he were too old for the responsibilities and challenges ahead, felt physically, intellectually, and spiritually exhausted by the time he left office in March 1809. In fact, he had essentially abdicated the presidency in the last half year of his second term, making his hand-picked successor, Madison, the de facto president of the United States months before his inaugural. Fortunately, Jefferson found healing and renewal at his beloved Monticello, particularly in the presence of his fabulous, beloved daughter Martha, and he lived 17 more years. And talk about great former presidents, Jefferson still had in him, exhaustion notwithstanding, one more great achievement, mightier perhaps than any other person who has ever been the President of the United States, by which I mean the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. Nobody else can match that, period. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.